Carter from Imeson and Carter. He's a member of our Mossy College of Engineering and Computer Science Advisory Board, as well as having an incredible career with Bechtel, working on big, exciting projects. And he's here to talk a little bit about some of the innovative ways that we can see and will see some exciting projects happening here in Oregon. So with that, I think we'd like to start our quick introductions.
Monsieur, Civil Environmental Engineering.
Steve Boyce, Master's of Science and Civil Engineering student.
Zach Horowitz, I'm also a Master's of Civil Engineering student.
River, undergraduate civil engineering student.
Kate Elliott, I'm a senior in the civil engineering department.
I'm Linda Murphy. I'm a second-year MERP student.
Matt Lasky. I'm a second-year Master of Urban and Regional Planning student.
Erin Wilson. I'm a first-year Masters of Planning student.
Karthik Srinivas. I'm also a first-year MERP.
Holly, I'm a MERP graduate.
Roger Gutierrez, civil engineering undergrad.
Kevin Provence, MERP graduate.
Peter Ovington, community development undergraduate.
Amin Wahab, City of Portland, environmental services.
Ken Rencher, MERP student.
Bob suggested that it might be of some interest to you to know a little bit more about my background. I'll try to do that very briefly so that no one falls asleep before we get to the subject. I was born and raised on a wheat and cattle ranch in Pendleton, Oregon, and my wife is also from Pendleton. I spent most of my career after I left Pendleton. I went to undergraduate school at Stanford University, and I went on to law school at Harvard Law School, and came back to clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for a year here in Portland with the then senior judge of the Ninth Circuit, John Kilkenny. I went to a law firm in San Francisco, the Thielen firm, which has long been noted for its work in the construction and engineering area, and was a partner there, and then went to Bechtel as their general counsel, and left that position and went into the business side in the late 80s, and did a variety of things at Bechtel. Served for about 15 years on their board of directors and on the executive committee that ran the company, and ultimately in the latter part of my career, a couple of other fellows and I fundamentally ran the company worldwide. I spent in Bechtel a variety of different positions. I ran almost every part of the company at one point or another, with the exception of the petroleum and chemical business. And I even had a little piece of that through Europe and the Middle East for a couple of years. So that's my background. I retired from Bechtel at the end of 2002, and which had always been my career plan. Actually, it was a year later than I had planned. Came back up to Portland, where I've been in the consulting business in transportation and energy projects and issues, and spent a lot of time with the wine business here in Oregon. I've raise grapes and make a pretty decent Pinot, and we've had a lot of fun. My family still, my wife's family still has a very large ranch in eastern Oregon, and we have a place in central Oregon. So I still maintain my connections to the Bay Area and spend quite a bit of time on a variety of boards both here and in the United Kingdom. Some of my consulting work is still focused on the British rail system. I serve on a board of London Continental Railways, which operates the Eurostar rail system and also is the owner and program developer for the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. You'll see a little on that here a little bit later. And I also serve on the board as the government's representative for the Cross London Rail Links Company, which is a new company that's designed to do a large cross-London heavy rail system that will go from Heathrow Airport connections to the City of London and then out into the docklands. I spend some time advising the Deputy Prime Minister and a lot of other time with the Department of Transport trying to reorganize their rail system, so hopefully the second time around we get it right. So that's my background, and I'm sure that there's lots of other things that are more interesting to you, but that's it for today. I'll answer questions about that later if anybody has an issue. Today I actually am very pleased to be here because I know you all are interested in transportation, and that is, in my view of the world, one of the more important parts of public spending and private spending that has been neglected for a long time. We have, as a country, used up the margin. You're all familiar with the term of engineering margin. We've used up the transportation margin that our parents and grandparents willed to us because we have found other uses for our public money. And as a result, as you look around not only the cities but also the rural areas of the United States, you see a deteriorated system in bad need of repair. Oregon's taken a large step in that direction in terms of this bridge project, which is a very significant commitment on the part of the state to do some of the repair work that needs to be done. And repair work is always less exciting and politically important than launching new projects with great vision. But the repair work that needs to be done probably is going to take up most of our public sector funding for the next decade. So let me talk a little bit about transportation financing and where the private sector fits in. I should tell you one of my biases when I start out is based on my decades in the business. The public sector system for developing and financing projects has some very, very important positives. It has some great policy components, but it is a system that ensures that the transportation project, if it's a large capital investment, will be the most expensive, take the longest time, and use outmoded technology. And that's built into the way the system works. We'll come back to that and spend some time. I'm sure there might be a question or two. On these large projects, and by large projects I mean either new freeways, new bridges, new rail systems. Each of these projects is like a Savile Row suit. They're all designed and they're all built as though no one has ever done one of those projects before. And the system and the process for review and approval of those projects treats them all as though they are a Savile Row suit. If you're in the retail business, you know that's not a very effective and efficient way to do transportation planning projects. The point that I wanted to talk a bit about today is to take the private sector and see what the private sector has to offer to this process. This is not about privatization. It's not about selling assets to the private sector. It's not about dumping risk on the private sector. It's not about many of the things that have come to be known as privatization. It's about using the private sector as a true partner in a combined public and private infrastructure project. It's also about using a mix of funding sources. Traditionally, funding sources for public sector projects only look to the public purse and do that normally through a bond issue or some other type of funding that requires that the bulk of the funds are all raised at once, done at a reasonable borrowing rate, but in terms of an effective application rate, not the most efficient way of actually using money. And there's good reason for that. You can't fund a project in the public sector unless you have assurances that the money will actually be there. So the federal system notwithstanding, normally from a state standpoint or local standpoint, it's important that the money actually be there, and of course when the money's there, then the cost of that money, the interest and the other things that go along with that, start immediately. The public-private projects that I'm going to talk about have used a mix of funding sources and have been able to marshal private capital to do some of the things at different stages in the project. So this is a little bit of a overview of what I'd like to discuss with you. There are really three main drivers to why this is a relevant topic today. The first is a scramble for money at almost every level of government. There have been effective lids put on the ability of the local state governments to raise property taxes. There's a hugely effective competition for federal funds, not just within the transportation sector, but from outside the transportation sector, that have made it much more difficult to use the kinds of funds that were available 50 years ago for transportation projects. Some of these have worked, and some of them haven't worked. There's never a situation where you get an absolute blanket success, and I think that's important to establish from the start. So I want to talk a little bit why the ones worked. Again, when we looked at the projects that might be suitable for use in a public-private partnership mode in the state of Oregon a year or so ago, when we were working on a transportation bill, Senate Bill 772, it was the consensus amongst those of us who were looking at it and ODOT that probably less than 10% of the projects that were on ODOT's list would actually be suitable for public-private funding. So it's not a panacea, it's not a cure-all for everything. It's the kind of thing where you get actually augmentation or supplementing the public purse in order to do these projects. Why partner with the private sector? The first 3 points we've already really talked about, and I think most people will take them as a given. There's a little argument around the edges as to how bad it is or how much better it could be. The fourth bullet about technology is quite an interesting one, and I always use the example of Caltrans. The California Department of Highways, which was a predecessor to Caltrans, was a kingdom unto itself and had, during the 60s and 70s, enormous funding in California and did just about everything internally within the department. They did design, they had thousands of engineers on their payroll. It was a very, very effective organization. When and among other things that they did is they had an entire staff that worked on keeping the technology up to speed so that their specifications were revised on a regular basis. They spent a lot of time and investment in making sure that they were current on things that happened with steel and concrete and other components of the projects that they were involved in. And by the time the 70s hit and the 80s hit and road building on that scale pretty much dried up in California, the successor organization, Caltrans, had to reduce itself in size and scale dramatically. Not surprisingly, one of the first things that went was the updating, which is not a very thrilling pastime, specifications. So if you were to consult today on specifications issued by Caltrans, the technological substance of most of those specs go back 30, 40 years. I haven't done a study of where ODOT is, but I know from talking to the director here that ODOT and WSDOT are probably not much different in terms of the resources that they have and the ability they have to update their specifications, which of course apply to the projects that they do, and codes to take account of current technology. There are some bright spots where government has always looked to match on a local level from gas taxes or from general fund obligations, or a dirty word in this state, but sales tax, and occasionally from user fees, another way of saying tolls. That is becoming, in many ways, a more acceptable way to augment the funding for transportation projects. In addition, you're starting to see the use of property development, peripheral incremental tax financing, things that have always been used in the urban renewal context but have not always been associated with transportation projects. That's a very healthy growth, and it's much easier for the private sector to be involved in projects where those types of things are available, because they are on their own a financeable part of the program that doesn't require that the financing be done by the government entity. There's another area that is starting to get more play, which I think is actually quite a useful thing, and that's the use of the government side of that partnership with the private sector to engage in credit enhancement. We'll talk about the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, which is a very good example of how the British government, without being directly involved in funding, has made the funding sources and the cost of funding for the Channel Tunnel Rail Link essentially a government-graded, as they call it, a gilt issue, because of a third-party removed guarantee that the financial markets look to and say, you know, if all else fails, they're there. But it's remote enough that it doesn't count on their balance sheet. So it doesn't count as government spending. It doesn't count as government borrowing. There's a few things that are always, we'll come back to the federal, the point on the federal legislation that I think is most important is they went through a schizophrenic phase about design-build and now have very clearly endorsed the concept of design-build for federal highways, which is a real positive development. Whether that actually relates to the street is not quite clear yet, but at least it's clear at the regulatory area that it is doable. These are all pretty straightforward things, but I wanted to talk about them in terms of, other than the obvious points that are made in the slide. The second to the last bullet there are always alternative investment options. With the private sector involved, there are certain rules that are more important than the government sector involvement. We have had a very benign interest rate environment for a long time. That environment has meant that yields for the private sector on traditional types of investment, even equity investments over the last 3 or 4 years, have been muted, which makes investment in infrastructure or infrastructure-related companies and projects competitive with market structures. If we get back into an inflationary environment, if we have the problem of, well, it's a good problem, but if we have the problem in competing for funds where the equity markets start to do double-digit returns again, it makes it much harder to get the private sector involved in these projects because there's always competition for the use of those funds. The innovation point is, I'll tell you one short story about this. There is an individual who I won't name who has probably cost the British government about £4 billion because of his insistence and his position on the use of a technique called moving block signaling for the major railroads in the UK. The problem with moving block signaling when applied to a 150-year-old rail system is that it is not proven technology. It's always difficult to make it work, and application in one section does not mean that it's compatible with use on other sections of the system. So as a result, a great effort was made on the West Coast Main Line in the UK to install moving block signaling. Another effort was made with the London Underground, and the net result has been disabling that system after several years of trying to make it work and trying to build and engineer around a system that is fundamentally unworkable without starting from a greenfield project level. So technology is important, but you have to be sure that the application of technology fits what it is that you're actually trying to do at the time. When we did the first extension of the London Underground in a long time, decades, it was the extension of the Jubilee line out to the Millennium Dome in the UK. We got asked to look at it when it was clear that they were going to have trouble making the Millennium celebration in time to get the to get the line open in time to actually carry people out to the dome, and that was really the only way you could get there. So the structure of the system, which had been managed by the London Underground, was actually quite effective in terms of the civil works. Civil works was great. They had everything pretty well on track and on schedule, not on budget, but that's a different issue. But they had done virtually nothing on the applications of the systems technology because they were grappling with how to make this moving block signaling piece work with a 100-year-old signaling system on the rest of the underground. So we got involved in that, sorted that out, dumbed the system down so it didn't have to use that technology, and essentially got it done on time. But there's a lot of great stories about how that happened, but it's just an example, again, about the technology. What makes a successful public-private partnership? These are all things that have to work. I think the ones that are most vulnerable are probably related to the logical sharing of risk and reward. Many times the government sector looks at a public-private partnership as an opportunity to move risk to the private sector. The problem with that is, as most of you know, if you've spent a lot of time thinking about how these contracts are formed, the only way to really manage risk is to put it with a party that actually can manage it. It's quite difficult to, for example, put the risk of changing government regulation on a private sector party, because the private sector party has absolutely no way to manage that risk. And there's absolutely no downside to the government of not managing that risk. That is a very common debate in the formation of these contracts, however. While it sounds logical in the abstract, when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, there is frequently a point of view in the government that the piece that you're dealing with shouldn't have to deal with the piece over here that might derail the program, because although they're government, they're not this part of the government. Fundamentally, that's unworkable for the private sector to deal with that risk. Either they can't control it, in which case it's ineffective, or they price it, and the price makes the project itself sustain an unacceptably high contingency risk and fee factor in the overall cost of the project. The flexibility of approach on the front end is another point which is deserving of comment. The normal way of looking at a project is different in the public sector than it is in the private sector. frequently the system is set up to do a complete design on the front end and then to go bid out the results of that design and then to start the work. And there's a certain amount of parallel processing with approvals and reviews and environmental reviews and local activities, but not much. Most of it waits until after the front-end design is done. There's no procurement done. In a private sector, if you look at a project 2 years ago, for example, when we all saw the rise in steel prices coming, the first thing that happens in the private sector is you buy the steel. You probably save enough in time and in money to pay for everything else that has to happen on the front end. Because the only design work you need to do on major steel sectors is to make sure that you have the right approach for how you're going to use steel. And then secondly, that you have a fabrication system that allows you flexibility if you have to make changes to the way that you apply the steel downstream. You cannot do that under a government procurement. It just doesn't happen. So if there is, and in some areas there are people in the government sector that are trying to work on some of these things in a more innovative way, you'll find that the differences between the public and private sector may actually diminish over time. Another thing that happens is that in the private sector, in a process plant, for example, almost all of the small pipe and electrical is field run. So your design for that is not done by an engineering design group. It's left basically blank so that the guys in the field, after they've made all the adjustments on where the walls are and they've moved doors around and they've changed rooms and they've done different elevations, will actually, with modern technology, can run those things and have the design captured on CAD/CAM immediately from handheld devices in the field, so that you don't spend the front end time frame engineering that stuff and then have to go through the change process, which is quite burdensome, incurring additional delays and costs in order to correct what was fundamentally doomed from the outset, because nothing is actually ever built the way it's designed on the front end. The other thing that partnering does with the private sector is that it cures some of the issues that are endemic to public sector bodies today, and that is they don't have enough money. So by bringing the private sector in, you can add resources, but you add resources when you want them, where you want them, and for as long as you want them, rather than having to put them on your own payroll and find yourself in a position where, from a budgetary standpoint, or from a changing face of the project you're doing, you have a mismatch between resources and expense. What are the barriers about the private sector? Well, the first ones go back to that slide I was showing about time and money and the things, and I won't go through that again. But one of the things about it is fairly obvious but rarely talked about, and that is that the private sector does have a sense of urgency. A value of time is extreme in the private sector. In the public sector, that's harder to grasp. And it's not good or bad, it's just a fact of life. That there's, in the public sector, there's much more ability and willingness to take a longer time to deal with things from a process standpoint, because it is not a financial drain on the public sector. In the private sector, if you had the kind of reviews and front-end process that it takes to put together a major capital project in the public sector, no company would engage in it. They would buy it or rent it, but they never actually invest in it because it would be way too expensive, and the time frame from start to finish and to market, it would be too great. Second thing is, the public sector frequently has, in these public-private partnerships, an uneasy feeling that there's a loss of control. The loss of control is hard to articulate in a way that is always consistent. But the first point has to do with, well, we may lose control over the technology or the specification requirements of the codes. And of course, that turns out not to be the case because those apply in any event for the project. The second thing is that without the sense of continual review of things, there's a sense that the job is diminished in importance. It's less important in many ways to be a direct manager or something than it is to be a reviewer. That's a human nature. There's no question about the fact that those things apply to it. We already talked about the risk transfer issue. I think the other is what I call a misalignment of expectations. Frequently, too much is expected of the private sector, and the private sector in that partnership expects too much of the public sector. Private sector says, well, let's go through these reviews at a faster pace. Let's stop all of this breaking in from the sidelines by third parties and interveners. You guys can control that. We expect you as our partner to deal with it. And the public sector doesn't always have the power to do that. In fact, rarely does. The public sector expectation is that the private sector is going to get all this stuff done faster and more efficiently, regardless of what role the public sector plays. Well, that's not the case either, because, as you know, it takes the alignment of interest in order to make something work well. To start out a program and say we're partners, and then to behave in an adversarial way throughout the rest of the project doesn't give you any advantages. There's nothing positive about that. In fact, there's probably more negative to it than the positive effort of trying to make it work. I think the next section here is getting to, let's see if we can get there. Yeah, have any of them worked? Yes, they have worked. One here locally that worked was the Airport Max. And it was done very quickly. From start to finish, it took just 2 months over 2 years. And I don't believe there's any other light rail project that can match that. It was done under budget, done ahead of schedule, and actually produced what it promised, a way to get to the airport, into the airport itself. And that's an important distinction because, and a real positive to Mike Thorne and the people who ran the Port of Portland at the time, because most airport operations, when they do get public transit to the airport, stop it somewhere far enough away that the cab drivers and the minibuses and all of the other people that have an economic interest in making sure it's not too easy to get to the airport can survive it. So if you look around the country and around the world, there are very, very few places that have what Portland has, that you can actually get on a light rail car downtown and go directly to the terminal. It is rather unique. SR 91 in Orange County, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. That's a project where fundamentally a toll lane was added to an existing freeway, and tolls were charged for it, and that toll lane was built and operated by a private sector company. Very successful because where SR 91 runs is very much like a bridge. It runs through a valley in the mountains, and so it looks like a bridge. When I was in this business years ago, I was for any toll road that looked like a bridge. If it didn't look like a bridge, I didn't want it, because the diversionary effect of tolls is dramatic, and you never know what it is. We built one in Turkey that was the equivalent of an interstate that cut 4 hours off the driving time from the Turkish capital to Istanbul, and truckers and everybody else didn't use it. And the reason they didn't use it were both social and economic. The economic reason was they put a toll on it, and of course the drivers didn't want to pay it. The social reason was they wanted to make sure it was absolutely pristine through these beautiful hills and everything else, so they had absolutely no commercial stuff alongside it. No roadhouses, no entertainment, no food, and certainly no place where they could stop and spend a night with various girlfriends and so forth. And so as a result, until they changed that model, that 4-lane freeway, 4 to 6-lane freeway remained virtually unused. Tacoma Narrows Bridge, now that's kind of an interesting one. We'll come back to that. A Channel Tunnel Rail Link we'll talk about. Pacific Bell Park, which is now SBC Park because of mergers in the telecoms business, was a private enterprise that actually worked quite well with very little public involvement, but has not proven to be a very viable model for the rest of the country because public entities are still willing to put up big bucks for private sector baseball and football clubs. And San Francisco wasn't, and they still got themselves a very nice ballpark. And then the London Underground, which has been privatized on the infrastructure side but not on the operations side. I'm not going to spend any time on this because you know about the airport max. You're aware of what's good. The part that hasn't quite worked out is the piece of the development of Cascade Station, which is essential to pay for all of the things that were done. Public sector in this case has gotten what they wanted early on, and they haven't exactly lived up to their commitments to the private sector on that development. But we're getting close, and hopefully that'll happen here in the next few weeks. As I said, the project was closed in June of '99, and in September of 2001 it was operating. Well, the photograph here doesn't seem to be working well. Oh, there we go. Okay. That's the part that has not yet been developed, but we're hoping to get very close to that soon. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge, this is an interesting project. It started out as a competition project for the private sector back in the early 90s. When I was at Bechtel, we won the right to build a new bridge, and the then government in the state of Washington was ousted unceremoniously. Political risk came into play, and this project had limped along for quite a long time. Finally, in October, I think it was October of '98, see if I can find that date, but in any event, that was '88, where they finally, '98, when they finally got a public vote to approve it. But it still took another 3 or 4 years before the then Governor Gary Locke finally said enough is enough and actually got the thing started. The financing program for it changed partly, well, totally because of legislative political issues having to do with private sector financing for a public project. And that's a policy issue, neither good nor bad, but different. Originally, the thought was there's, I think, a $3 toll on the bridge when it's completed. The original thought was that tolls and property development at both ends of the bridge would actually support the financing of the bridge. It probably would have done that. However, the decision was made by the legislature that they would prefer to put this in traditional public sector financing format, which they did. The project itself is going quite well, and it still has the private sector involved, both from it's a Bechtel-Kiewit joint venture, both from the standpoint of actually developing, designing, and building the project. I think if you talk to folks at WashDOT, they would give you pretty high marks on how this project has gone. Channel Tunnel Rail Link. This was Maggie Thatcher's promise to build a high-speed link from the Channel Tunnel to London, which proved to be a bit harder than predicted originally, but eventually was, in the mid-90s, was put into the private sector. The issue of how it went from there is a long story, which I won't bore you with, but what happened was deregulation of it, in part, of the airlines, which allowed the airlines to essentially compete effectively with the cost of travel by rail, so that the JetBlues and and the other airlines decided that they could actually move a lot of people at a very low price, which cut down the projections for usage of the tunnel over a period of time. It's had a catastrophic effect on Eurotunnel, which is bankrupt fundamentally, which is the owner of the Channel Tunnel itself. And it had an effect on the Channel Tunnel rail link, which was quite dramatic. And we restructured it, had to renegotiate the program in '97. When we did that, we then changed the way that it was financed. We brought the government into the private company that was in charge of this project as a stakeholder, a majority stakeholder, and set up a system that allows them downstream to actually take over the ultimate ownership of the program. Private investors have their money back out of it. It's been a terrific project. It's from soup to nuts. It's about 68 miles from Dover and Folkestone up to St. Pancreas, which is the terminus in London. The first part was opened in 2003 and has actually exceeded the projections in terms of ridership. Ultimately, when this is done, you will actually be able to go from downtown London to Paris and Brussels faster than you can go to the airport and take an airplane. So it will be quite competitive at the end, but the front end of it, because the last link from Ebbsfleet into London itself is not completed and won't be completed for another 2 years, it was very difficult to compete. Since you're engineers, I think you might like to take a look at a few of these photos. This is one of the mainline bridges. It's the first greenfield railway in 100 years in the UK. It is truly a high-speed rail system, and as a result, everything was built from scratch. But because of the fact you're going through an area in an old country where there's a lot of other stuff there, you were always trying to figure out tunnels, bridges, ways around, parallel paths, other things that would allow you to have a dedicated train path to allow high-speed rail system to operate. At the end of the day, almost everything had to be built from scratch. The front end of it that was opened up used the last link into Waterloo over existing tracks, but it added about 35 or 40 minutes to the ultimate time that will be available from St. Pancreas. It's a large project, about $12 billion, probably closer to $15 billion in real terms today, because those are inflation-adjusted dollars. I told you about the financing of it. Basically, what the government did is they had a certain component of it that they were going to finance anyway. They backed the rest of it with a third-tier guarantee, and as a result, the owning company, London Continental Railroads, has been able to finance it at the equivalent of what we would call treasury rates, which has saved hundreds of millions of dollars in financing. The other thing that's happened is, because it's done on the private sector side, is that it's cut about 4 years off the construction of what would happen if they had to do it in Serratum and parallel operations under the procurement process with the British government. So it's gone quite well. Just a couple of photos here of the kind of tunneling work that had to be done. These are normally, all of these tunnels were done with boring machines, and they were done as separate tunnels so that they were not interrelated. If you're familiar with the Channel Tunnel, it's actually 3 tunnels. There's one way, one direction, one way the other direction, and the emergency tunnel through the center. And very similar system was used for these. There are very few tunnels that have actually 2-track systems within the same tunnel. This is under the Thames. Fortunately, the average annual rainfall there was very low, so no leaks, and we can thank the great chalk program there. This is on the north end of it. at St. Pancreas Station. And it's very interesting because this is a listed building. The St. Pancreas Station is a Victorian brick rail station with a great Barlow shed, which I'll show you in a minute. And we had to build an entire new access for an entirely new railroad into that station without doing anything to disturb the historical nature of the building. The West Coast Main Line, the East Coast Main Line, Midlands, freight lines, the London Underground, everything comes to a head here in this section of London's transportation system. So it was a huge issue in terms of interferences. The Barlow shed, which is an interesting part of it, and this is part of the new rail system on the platforms that we are installing, was completely like a hothouse when it was built. And over the years, as they've replaced the panels, they got tired of putting up new panels of glass and washing them and doing all those things, so they've just put up panels that are opaque, of plastic and all sorts of other things. When this is restored, it will be restored to its original design, which means that every one of those panels you see black there will be clear glass, and the entire interior of the station will be like a greenhouse in terms of its light and airy approach. In the background, you can see another structure. Those are, because the station is so old, it doesn't have capacity for all of the train sets that need to be terminated there, and that's a modern adjunct which will take about half the traffic for those train sets. Another example of how this Barlow shed comes into the brick, and this is the back end of it from the Barlow shed standpoint. It's a fascinating structure, and I urge any of you who are over there to do it. Now, part of this renovation was paid for by taking the old train station and turning it into a Marriott hotel. It had been used by the British government for civil servants, and they had gone through and lowered the ceilings and put in all these wonderful little work cubby holes and things of that nature. When they removed all this, they realized that they had these original grand rooms that, in some cases, they'd made 3 different levels out of one room. So the ceilings, and they had all the original work there, all the original rock work, all the original tile and marble. It's an absolutely gorgeous building. And Marriott was willing to pay a lot of money to operate it and renovate it. The money from that alone will take care of replacing all of those panels in the Barlow shed. So, again, private sector money involved in a very public project. So how do we find more of these that actually work? Well, it's very hard to work with the public sector in a way that allows you to put in an idea. The public sector is not amenable to unsolicited proposals. The new law in Oregon is supposed to allow that. We'll see. Because the issue that comes up is the unsolicited proposal is a very unsettling concept in the public sector. Maybe it isn't the priority that they want to do with the money that they have, and even though logically you say, well, yeah, but this is coming with money that you don't have, so why not make that a priority? It's very difficult to do that. On the other hand, if you talk to ODOT, a lot of things that would be priorities aren't because they don't have the money. So what you have is a priority list that's driven by funds that are available. And as a result, when there is a project they'd really like to have, but it's outside their means, it doesn't make it on the priority list because it would be a useless act. There's no sense in putting a project on there that you're not going to be able to fund. Secondly, you have to have a process for making sure if you do get unsolicited proposals that you have a way of screening them and telling the proposer in the private sector that it's acceptable, it's unacceptable, before they have to invest millions of dollars in front-end stuff. That's, again, not a comfortable act for a government entity because they don't want to make promises that they can't ultimately deliver, and the private sector doesn't want to have to do the complete engineering process and then find out it doesn't fit what the public sector wants. Obviously, there's a lot of room in between, but working out what is actually going to work for both the public and private sector is not done. There's a lot of work to be done on that. And I think both Bruce Warner and Doug McDonald have done an excellent job in this region. The director of WashDOT and the director of ODOT have done an excellent job of trying to work toward a workable solution on that front. And I think you'll see that happen here earlier than in most parts of the country. There are very few places that have two adjoining states that have so much in common with their transportation needs that are working together the way Oregon and Washington are, which is a good thing. Second thing is balanced risk sharing. There is a view in a public-private partnership that all the front-end risk is on the private partner, and they're willing to put in a lot of money, and if it works, great. If it doesn't work, well, then that's just the way it goes. If you've been on the private sector side, you understand that isn't exactly the way they'd like it to work. And the risk money that is put up is the most important and most expensive money that private sector has. So there has to be a process for both risk sharing and cost sharing on the front end so that there is an alignment of interest and a stake in the public sector in making sure that they are actually trying to get to something that works. On the financing side, as I mentioned earlier, that changes with the markets. I happen to think we've probably got another couple of years of pretty good environment for private sector financing being applied to public works. It will continue to be good if the public sector is willing to use their credit enhancement capabilities. That is not something that's built into the regulations and the statutory requirements in most states. There's some work on that in Washington. There's some work on that in Oregon. If it's successful, it will be enormously helpful. Lastly, the public support, process simplification, fairly obvious things. Here's some ideas that have been floated as to things in this area that might work, that might fall within that category. A lot of earlier discussion about the I-5 bridge. It's hard to say where that's going, but that's it. I'm open for questions. I'm sorry it took a little longer than I planned. Sure.
So, you talked about the Cascade Station.
Yes.
So, do you think a longer public process at the start of the project would have benefited Cascade Station?
No. No, two things happened there. One is there was the public sector had an unrealistic expectation of what the market would support there and applied a list of conditions to the development there that were unattainable. Secondly, the market changed. So it was a combination of things happening on the public side and on the private side. The ability to respond to that change has been much more difficult than was anticipated. So it's just taken a lot longer. And it's like everything else, time is the enemy of investment. Yes?
On these public-private partnerships such as Cascade Station, you talked about the need for government to carry some of the risk management when it comes to legislation. How can the private sector protect itself from things that it has no control over? Are there performance standard techniques so that there's a guaranteed kind of at least a floor return to their investment? Or is it totally...
Well, I think there's probably an hour-long discussion about that because there's lots of different things. No, there's lots of different things you can do, but fundamentally it is making sure that the public sector and the private sector are absolutely aligned on the expectations of the process so that you don't have the private sector trying to produce something that's unacceptable from the get-go and the public sector sits back and waits for it to appear and then says no. You have to have that absolutely integrated from the start. If you do, then the public sector also has tools that they can shorten the time required for review. I mean, there's the tendency is to take the maximum time for review in the public sector. That's not necessary. But it takes a commitment by the public sector side of the equation to shorten that time frame. And in some cases, it takes special legislation because sometimes these projects don't actually fit the process that is designed for a different type of project. And you need people on the front end that are willing to take a little risk and say, yes, we want to have that happen. And that's what happened with the airport. There was no federal money in the airport MAX. That helped us enormously. But in return for that, we had to find other places of financing. And so we came up with some innovative ideas. The commitment to make sure that those other ideas actually resulted in financial support for the project was there at the start, faltered in the middle, seems to be in the process of being reconstituted. Yes?
Regarding your comments about, like, say, the current interest rate environment, I've always wondered why now is not the time that public agencies have sort of not undertaken a massive amount of borrowing to pay for infrastructure improvements and additions. It seems with the number of projects that could be, where the private sector could be incorporated in terms of a money-making venture for them, what do you see as the major impediments? And do you think that if the government started changing their ways and really wanted to start doing it now, is it too late for them to start borrowing the money?
Well, I think the first problem is it's illegal, which generally tends to slow down people. The public sector is not allowed to borrow unless it has something that's gone through all of the check marks for approval, and then can be financed on the basis of the financial arrangements that are in place legislatively and regulatorily for that particular type of project. Having a private sector partner actually helps that process enormously. For example, the estimates of replacing the Interstate Bridge, one of 2 lift spans left on the entire interstate system in the country, a navigation hazard, and a variety of other issues with it, including some seismic issues. The cost of replacement of that bridge may be $800 million to $1 billion. It can be a little more, it can be a little less. The longer it takes to get there, the more it will cost. So the cost is going up as we speak. But the public sector can't borrow the money to do that today. You just can't do it. I mean, it's not permissible. And you wouldn't, as a taxpayer, you wouldn't want them to do it. Because, among other things, if they borrow the money, you have no guarantee it's actually going to go to that project, because the borrowing is not directly related to a project that's been approved. So the private sector, on the other hand, can do some things in terms of incremental borrowing. In other words, if they have a guarantee they're going to get paid back when this thing comes out at the end and the big borrowing is done, they'd be willing to front end some stuff at a cost, but nonetheless, the cost of actually being able to get that work done on the front end would result in enough of a savings, it would be worth the government to pay a little bit more on the back end. So, that's just one example. But, the way the process works today is probably, I don't want to use numbers because I don't know what people are actually using today, but it's years before they'll ever get to the point of actually having an approval that they can go forward and do any financing. And the nature of the problems in financing in the public sector is to reduce the scope of projects. It costs less money. You have to finance less, not to expand them. The nature of the private sector is to say, well, wait a minute. Instead of just replacing a bridge here, why don't you fix the rail stuff on the Vancouver side? Why don't you get better access to the port? Why don't you do something about the I-84 interchange? Why don't you do something about what's going on with light rail? There's about 6 different things that you could fix all at once that will cost you, 30%, 60%, who knows, less than if you do them individually. But the public sector can't do that. They need to have a vehicle to do that, and a public-private partnership is one way to do it. Yes, next question. Anybody? Yeah.
I guess you were just talking about this a second ago, a question I had, but do you think that the nature of the public project's scope changes because of the interests of private budget, schedule, and so forth for the better or for the worse?
Well, I happen to think that the private sector involvement is a big plus. Let me give you an example. Look at the San Francisco Bay Bridge. Mess. Total mess right now. You know, it's what, $2 billion over their cost estimates. Classic public sector project. Let's go out and have a competition for the design, right? The designers had never built anything. So when they tried to build it, they found out, by gosh, it's pretty hard to build this sucker. Doesn't work. They're already in it, well into it before they make that decision. Next decision is the state says, we haven't got the money, so let's build a real simple one. But they didn't do the design work either. So the real simple one is now being attacked on a seismic basis. So what you have is you have an absolutely unworkable project that people have already spent somewhere between $4 or $6 billion on. You know, so why is that? Why would that not happen in the private sector? Because in the private sector, if you do it right, you get people who can actually build something doing the design work. You know, I mean, there's one of the great mysteries to me is what this is, and I'm sorry to use this example, but it's the concept of lump sum design. That's a really interesting concept. There are a lot of state agencies, one right across the river, that at one point in their career concluded that they were going to do lump sum design, make sure they didn't have any cost overruns on design. Well, they got exactly what they paid for, which is whenever the designer ran out of money, he stopped. You know, so then they got bids on the construction side. The construction guy said, well, this is really interesting, but there's a blank spot between point A and point B here, and I have no clue, so I'll just put in 3x what I thought it might cost if I could assume that that was the way it was going to be from before. So it's I mean, the process, and it's easy to be critical of the process, but it's not appropriate to be critical of the process without thinking about the context in which it developed over time to ensure participation by a variety of different people, by a variety of different companies, to ensure that the product matches the policy objectives of the government, that matches the codes and the specifications and the safety requirements. All of those things are worthy objectives. The way they get translated is to the lowest common denominator. And what the government needs to be able to do is to say, well, okay, actually, we can do it differently on these large capital projects. And that's what they're trying to figure out a way to do. Other questions? Bob, I'm well over my time here.
I'll just ask one last question because we had an internet viewer with a question about the
final product, and you kind of alluded to this, but the question was, is there a difference in the quality of the final product between a design done in the private sector versus the public sector?
There doesn't have to be. I would tell you that I think that the difference in the design and the final product should be better with private sector involvement. And I'll tell you a very simple reason why. It goes back to my point about technology and the use of new materials, new processes, new ways of design. We used to, at Bechtel, we used to be just like a state government. Man, we wanted people to build things to our design. We were about 10 years behind what the guys were doing out there that were on a performance spec basis. And so we got exactly what we wanted, and it cost twice as much as what our competitors were getting on a performance spec basis. And the performance spec worked better. So we gave that up. It took us a while to get there, but we gave that up. Oh, I mean, I tell you, it was an internal riot from the engineers. But nonetheless, and it doesn't always work that way, because if you don't have some ball control over that and you don't have confidence in the people that are doing the design, you can always end up with a product that is less desirable because people are cutting corners on the design, which is why performance spec approach is a much better approach than a design spec approach. But you have to have the intelligence and the capability within your organization to be able to review what is being offered to the performance spec. Does that answer your question?
To end it there, but before we thank our speaker, I just want to remind you that next week Noel Dobson will be here from the American Heart Association talking about creating active communities, how transportation systems impact physical activity. So let's thank Mr. Carter for his presentation.
Thank you.